Hi everyone and welcome back to the Kenwood Kids Club. This week I'm going to be showing you how to make a truly classic recipe, one that I'm sure many of you will have eaten before, if not made before, and that is the Humble Jam Tart. Now I say the Humble Jam Tart because I think it's one of those recipes that people have been making and eating for years and years and years, and they're so simple that many of you I'm sure will have tried them before. There's a reason why they have stuck around for so long, and I think it's purely because they are so delicious, and they're a fantastic way to use up any leftover jams or curds or fillings that you've used in cakes that you've made. Now the first thing we're going to do today is make a very simple sweet short crust pastry, and I'm actually going to do all the work in my food processor today. Short crust pastry works best when we don't handle it very much at all. If we keep it cold and we don't use our fingers very much, we should end up with a fantastic pastry base for our tarts. And by doing it in the food processor, it means that I'm not having to touch it with my really warm hands at all. If you've got one of these, absolutely brilliant, but don't panic if you haven't, because we do have recipes right here on the channel where we've made pastry before without using any equipment at all. So do feel free, if you haven't got a food processor, to go back over to the main channel video list and just search for our other pastry videos. But for today, I think we need to get started. So, the first thing we're going to do is take some plain flour, and that's flour without any raising agent in it at all. And we're going to pop that into the main part of our food processor. In with it, we're going to add some butter, and this butter is really cold. I've had this sat in the fridge since I chopped it up into these chunks, and that's really going to help this pastry along. What we're going to do is use the blades of the food processor to break up that butter into the flour until it looks like fresh breadcrumbs. If your butter is cold, it's a lot easier to do that. So I'm going to pop this on. It will be loud, but don't worry, I can jump ahead to when it's ready. It really doesn't take very long at all. I think that was probably about 30 seconds at most. And you should find now that if you look inside your bowl, you've ended up with this kind of breadcrumby consistency, and you shouldn't see any big chunks of butter at all. When you get to this stage, we're going to add in some caster sugar. And again, we're just going to use the food processor to mix that through, so it won't take very long, just a couple of seconds. And that's the thing really that turns a short crust pastry into a sweet short crust pastry, so very important. Last up, all we're going to do is add in our wet ingredients, and that is 1 large egg and some milk. I'm going to start by cracking the egg into a bowl as always. The main reason I do that, it just means that if I drop any shell, it's a lot easier to get it out of here than it is to get it out of there. Give it a quick mix with a fork just to break up that yolk. And then that can go straight into the food processor too. Finally, 2 tablespoons of really cold milk. That's come straight from the fridge too. Pop the lid back on, and we're just mixing this time until the dough starts to come together in a lump. When you see your dough starting to clump together, it's the perfect time to take it out of the food processor, and you'll need to be careful because of course there are blades in here, so you might want to get an adult to take those out for you first. And you'll notice it's still very crumbly and crummy at the moment, but that's fine because what we're going to do now is turn it out onto the work surface and just very lightly squeeze it together. Again, short crust pastry dough doesn't like to be touched too much, so you don't want to handle it too much at this point. Literally just squishing it together into a big solid lump. If you feel like it's too dry, if it's a bit too crumbly, then what you can also do is just add a tiny bit more water at this stage, but no more than a tablespoonful, otherwise you could end up with a dough that's too wet. Hopefully you can see though that mine has come together in a big lump, and that is exactly what we're looking for. So once you get to this stage, all I'm going to do is wrap this up in some cling film, and I'm going to pop it back in the fridge for about half an hour. The cling film is going to stop it forming almost like a skin or a crust on the outside, and the fridge is going to make sure that everything stays nice and chilled, which of course we've already heard is really important for a short crust pastry. My favourite way to do this is to actually fold the cling film into kind of a rectangle shape with a bit of extra room, and then I can use my rolling pin to roll it out a little bit in the cling film and make sure it's nice and flat. That's just going to help it chill down really quickly in the fridge so that I can work with it a bit sooner. Once you've done that, you should end up with something that looks a little bit like this, and then that can go in the fridge for about 30 minutes. So I'm going to go and do that, and then I'll see you in a second for the next step of this recipe. Okay, so my pastry is nicely chilled, and while it's been in the fridge, I've also greased and lined my tin. Now, I have a confession. In the recipe, I said that you should use a shallow tart tin, but I don't actually have a shallow tart tin. I tend to bake my things like jam tarts, mince pies and things in the same muffin tins that I use for my cupcakes. They're a bit trickier to use because they're slightly deeper, and of course we don't want really deep jam tarts. So what I've done is I've greased the inside of each hole or each section using a little bit of butter, and then I've laid a strip of baking paper across each one. And hopefully that should mean that when it comes time to remove my jam tarts, I can just lift them up with that baking paper and they'll come straight out. Again, in the recipe, I say to use a pastry cutter that is slightly larger than the size of the hole in your tin. But again, because I'm using those deep holes, I don't want to fill up the whole thing with pastry because again, my jam tarts will be really deep. So instead, I've got a pastry cutter that's 7 centimeters, and that's the same diameter, so the distance from one side of the circle to the other, as each hole in my muffin tin. That means that when I add the pastry to the tin, it should only about half fill up the size of each hole or each section. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, get in touch with me. I'm on social media as Mr. Baker's Cakes, and I can help you out. But now we're going to roll out our pastry. So let's remove it from this cling film. And it will still be crumbly. That is normal. That is a short crust pastry. But the thing we're going to do to help us is just pop a little bit more of that plain flour onto our work surface. Not too much because we don't want to change the consistency of our pastry, but enough that it shouldn't stick too much. And then I'm going to put a tiny bit more on the top as well. Now I want to roll this out to about 3 millimeters thick. So that's something you might need an adult to help you with because you want your pastry to be quite thin, but not so thin that it just falls apart. As I say, it is still crumbly, but that's fine. If it does what mine's doing here, where it forms a big old crack, you can literally just push it back together. Now we only need to get 12 pastry rounds out of this mixture, so we don't need to roll it huge. Just enough that you can fit 3 of these in that direction and 4 in that direction. When you're happy that your pastry is rolled out enough, you're just going to take that pastry cutter, and then you can use either the round side or the fluted side, it's up to you, to just cut out 12 rounds of your pastry. Then, very carefully, we're going to place them down inside each hole of the muffin tin, pushing it down into the corners gently with our fingers so it creates a little kind of tart shape. And if I hold this up to this camera, hopefully you can see what I've done there. So I've just got a little lip around the outside, and then the rest is flat on the bottom. I'm going to do that 12 more times, and then we'll move on. Once you've done that, you should end up with something that looks a little bit like these. Now, I've still got quite a bit of pastry left here, so I could do another batch if I wanted to, but what I will say, just like when we made scones, gosh, last year now, just like when we've made other pastry things before, every time you recombine your dough and roll it out again, it will get slightly less short, which means it will be less crispy when you eat it. I personally don't really mind that if I'm just eating them at home, so it's up to you if you want to carry on. Equally, you could use a slightly larger pastry cutter and cut out slightly larger tart cases, I guess, which means you could put more jam in them, but I really like my jam tarts to be quite small and dainty, which is why I have gone for the 7cm cutter. Another quick top tip just before we move on is if when you're pushing them flat into each section you find that you end up with a tiny little hole or a crack, you can take a tiny extra piece of pastry and just use that over the top to patch that hole. It will be hidden inside so nobody will ever know, and it just makes sure that your jam isn't going to leak through, because if it does that then what can happen is the jam sticks the pastry to the tin and you're not going to get those out in one piece. So have a quick look, just check there's nowhere that you think, oh, a little bit of a patch might be helpful there, and then you're ready for the final step before baking, which of course is adding our jam. Now I'm just using a jam that I bought from the shop, and actually this is a jam that I've already used in another recipe, so it's already open, and I'm just going to give it a quick stir because, as I said earlier, this is a great way to use up leftover jam. And then I'm just using a teaspoon to add a teaspoon of mixture to each case. Again, if you go for a slightly deeper pastry case, you can add more, but I like mine to be small, as I said. It can be very tempting to want to add extra jam to your jam tarts, but what will happen is as it cooks it starts to bubble, and if it bubbles up over the side of the pastry case it can cause them again to get stuck inside the tin. So this is one of those times that less is definitely more. And then once you've done that, your tarts should look a little something like this. Now your tarts need to go into a preheated oven at 200 degrees C, which is 180 degrees fan or gas mark 6, for around about 15 minutes. What you're looking for is that the pastry will be starting to turn a golden brown on those tops and that jam will be starting to bubble. Once that's done, this is really important. They will be so hot, so don't be tempted to try one fresh out of the oven. You must let them cool down, because jam that has come straight from the oven is, I swear it's as hot as lava. So do let them cool down before you try and eat them. But I'm gonna go and pop mine in the oven and I'll see you very shortly so we can see how they come out. And after that 15 minutes bake time, you should have something that looks like this. Now these have actually been cooling in the tin for about 5 minutes, and now what I'm going to do is transfer them onto a cooling rack. So you can see I'm able to touch the tin now because it's had that additional cooling time, and then if this works, I hate doing things like this on film, I should just be able to lift up those tarts using that baking paper and pop them straight onto that cooling rack. As I say, if the jam has bubbled up and over the sides, then you might find that a little bit trickier, but hopefully, if not, it should just be as simple as lifting them up with the paper, slide the paper out from underneath, and then pop them straight on that cooling rack. And hopefully you can see that they are really nice and small and delicate, the perfect combination of jam and pastry. So I'm going to finish transferring these over, and then perhaps we can give one a try. Now, as I said earlier on, jam when it freshly comes out of the oven really is very hot, and it will take it quite a while to cool down. So although the tarts might not feel too hot at this stage, I still wouldn't give them a try until they've had a chance to completely cool down. Otherwise you could burn yourself on that jam, and of course we want to make sure we are keeping safe. That being said, obviously I always round off the videos by giving everything a taste, so what I'm going to do is pick one of these tarts and just take a little bit off the side in the hope that I can let that jam cool down a little bit more before we give it a taste. So I filled these with a raspberry jam, and it's got all the seeds in it as well, so it gives them a really nice kind of look to them, and they look properly homemade rather than the ones that you buy in the shops. I'm going to give this a taste. Those are really yummy. So that pastry has got a nice crispness to it because we kept it nice and short by not over handling it with our hands. It's really buttery, even though we didn't put tons of butter in. And then of course we've got that lovely jam flavour, so it's worth choosing a good quality jam. Of course if you make your own, even better. I did suggest in the recipe too that Finn, one of our junior ambassadors, we love Finn, did a recipe right here on the Kids Club channel a while ago where he made lemon curd. And lemon curd goes absolutely brilliantly in tarts like this as well. So why not have a go at Finn's lemon curd recipe and then use that in your jam tarts? Although I guess they would be lemon curd tarts. Who knows? Now I was hoping to be able to announce the winner of our December Star Baker of the Month competition in this week's video, but unfortunately the person over at Kenwood that I normally speak to and decide with hasn't got back to me yet, so I'm afraid I can't tell you who our winner's going to be. I guess you'll have to just come back next week and find out. That does of course mean that it's the perfect time for you to have a go at my jam tart recipe and get your entries in for our Star Baker of the Month for January competition. If you've not entered before, all you need to do is head over to the Kenwood Kids Club website, which is linked down in the video description. Click on the link there, it will take you straight to the Kenwood Kids Club website, and you just need to make sure you are registered. As soon as you register, you'll also be sent your very own membership card as well, which is really cool. Then, bake up a batch of my jam tarts, take a photo and upload it to the website, and who knows, in February, gosh, that's really soon now, in February I could be announcing you as our Star Baker of the Month for January. So if you do decide to have a go, let me wish you the very best of luck. And don't forget, of course, to come back at the same time next week where one of our junior ambassadors, I believe it's Reese, will be cooking up one of his favourite recipes for you all. A good way to make sure you don't forget is to click on the big red subscribe button down there on the right. But on that note, I think I'm going to wrap things up here. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you at the same time next week. Until then, stay safe, take care, and as always, happy baking.